Hello and welcome to this review of the new Kailh Silent BOX switches. I received a batch of both switches from Kailh a while ago, and I did a teardown video recently where I showed the innards and workings of these switches in detail. If you haven't seen it yet, go and have a look. I used my GMMK as a testing bed for these, but the review will not focus on the GMMK itself. There is a separate full review of that keyboard that I did a while ago. I just used this as a hot swappable testing chassis. The Silent BOX switches have some interesting properties. As I mentioned during the teardown, they use a round slider instead of a square one, and they use rubber dampeners in the slider to cushion the impact, which is what makes them relatively silent, as switch noise from linear and tactile switches comes almost entirely from clack, which is the sound that the slider makes when it impacts the housing. Clack is in contrast to click, which is a sound made by a specific part called the clicker. The two main differences between clack and click is that clack is unintentional, whereas click is intentional, and that clack can't be heard if you press a switch softly, whereas a clicker will click regardless of how soft or hard a switch is pressed. The dampening system is more or less identical to Cherry's implementation of silent switches, except in a box housing. I have a Leopold with MX Silent Reds in it here that I reviewed ages ago, which I used to benchmark key feel against. But for a detailed sound comparison, I'm going to use a loose MX Silent Red switch inside the GMMK itself, because the Leopold is a very different factory silenced chassis, whereas the GMMK is almost the exact opposite of that, so this would completely skew a direct comparison, never mind the fact that I decked this one out with some non-stock keycaps. Feel-wise, the box switches are a bit smoother than the MX ones. It's not a huge difference, quite subtle I'd say, but it is there. The weighting is also different. The box pinks are even lighter than MX Silent Red, or pink as it's sometimes known. Now, generally speaking, silenced switches have slightly shorter throw than the parent switch from which they are derived. Specifically, the travel is made shorter by the amount that the dampeners poke outside of the switch. For example, in Cherry MX silent switches, the travel is reduced from 4.0 to 3.7 millimeters. However, according to the design documents for the Kailh BOX silent switches, this is not the case for this design. The total travel is exactly the same at 3.6 millimeters. Now, I'm not completely sure if that's really true. It feels slightly shorter, and I measured it with some basic tools. Admittedly, they are very basic, just some digital calipers, and the travel does appear to be shorter. So maybe it's just suggestivity or something working on me. It could very well be that the travel is actually exactly the same. The linear ones are very light, by the way, just 35 grams. The tactile ones are 45 grams, which is more like what MX Browns are like, but 35 grams is really not a lot. But I must admit, it didn't as much feel like it. Still, it's a nice weighting, and they only very rarely set off under the weight of my fingers. This last bit is actually really rather weird because 35 grams is very, very light, and I know stiffer switches than that which actuate quite easily under the weight of my fingers. So the fact that these don't fire like crazy is a minor miracle, and frankly I have no explanation for this. It's nice, don't get me wrong, but I don't understand it. Of course, one of the prime concerns about dampened switches is mushiness. After all, you're typing on a rubber dampener rather than on a solid plastic slider, and this invariably carries with it at least some degree of mushification of the typing feel with it, but it's worse in some than it is in others. However, in a good design, it's not too much, and in these ones the feel is pretty firm. I'd say it's comparable to that of Cherry MX silent switches, and they weren't that bad. Sound-wise, it's exactly the same. I took two keys that sounded virtually identical on the keyboard, swapped one of them for a Cherry MX Silent Red switch, and I forgot which one, and I still don't know because they sound exactly the same. So audibly, it's very similar to Cherry MX Silent Red. Which is not bad, by the way. I already remarked in my review of the Leopold that the MX Silent dampening is vastly more effective than the Alps system on which it is based. So overall, you get a pretty silent switch. The tactility of the brown switches is generated by an MX-style notch in the slider cam which operates the contacts, although unlike MX switches, it does so through an intermediary pusher poking out of the contact box, rather than by pushing on the contacts directly. As a result, the tactility is more of a raspy, rough feeling than a true event, so to speak, but compared to Cherry MX Brown, it is definitely more pronounced, possibly because of the size or angle of the notch, or both. That said, I'm not sure I would recommend this as a tactile switch, although in its defense, the market for tactile switches at the moment is absolutely abysmal. Overall, they're not exactly a revolution in terms of switch innovation, really they're just a box version of MX Silent, but they feel nice, and the linear ones are a bit lighter at no cost of hypersensitivity, and the tactile ones are a bit more tactile than MX Brown, although they're still not fundamentally improved. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on these switches. Please keep in mind that this is not a very silent chassis, so you'd better be off using something different yourself.